Okay, so we're going to start this webinar. Welcome everybody to this webinar of the European Childhood Obesity Group. We will have David Thivel, ECOG Vice President today, that will introduce this webinar. But before he does so, I will just briefly invite you to read the rules of this webinar or the practical information. This webinar is recorded and it will be made available together with the slides on the ECOG website and YouTube channel. Q&A is foreseen after each presentation and at the very end of this webinar. If you wish to ask a question, please write it down by using the Q&A tool and not the chat, and mention clearly whom your question is directed to. David, if you like, you can start the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Milena, for this kind introduction. And I'm David Thivel. I'm very lucky to be the Vice President of the European Childhood Obesity Group. And I'm definitely honored today to introduce this webinar dedicated to ultra-processed food with three key speakers, eminent speakers, I would say, in the field of ultra-processed food. So first, Carlos Monteiro, Professor Carlos Monteiro, who is professor at the Department of Nutrition and School of Public Health in Sao Paulo, will give us an overview of ultra-processed food, and then we will have two other talks led by Daniela Neri, also from Sao Paulo, and then from Neha Khandpur, who is also a research scientist in Sao Paulo and obviously a long time friend. So maybe Carlos, Milena, maybe you can change the slide. Thank you. So why do we want to talk about ultra-processed food, and why is there an interest regarding ultra-processed food in pediatric population and specifically in kids with obesity? Well, this topic has emerged a couple of years ago within the European Childhood Obesity Group with the publication of an editorial in the Annals of Nutrition and Metabolism dedicated to ultra-processed food and the prevention and treatment of pediatric obesity. And back then, Carlos, Daniela, and Nia were already leading this topic with us, and it's definitely the symbol of a great collaboration between Brazilian researcher and our European society. This is how we decided basically to host this webinar today. So we could change the slide, please, Milena. Yes, thank you. So as I said, first, Professor Carlos Monteiro will give the introductory talk, and he will talk about the NOVA food classification system, and he will give us an overview of the rationale and description around this system. Right after that, we will have a second talk with Daniela Neri, who is going to talk about the consumption of ultra-processed food and how it might impact the health and overall health of our kids, normal weight and kids with overweight and obesity. And then we will have the final talk by Neha Khandpur, who is going to talk more about the policy measures to address ultra-processed food consumption and how collectively we could act in order to refrain the consumption of ultra-processed food. So now I think I said enough. I maybe said too much, and I'm very happy to give the floor to Professor Monteiro. I'm very honored that you agreed to give this talk for our society. So please, the floor is yours. Oh, you have a couple of questions.
I'm mute. Yes, yeah. Okay, so thank you, David. Hello, everybody. I will share my screen to make my presentation. Okay, no. No, first, I think you...
The question is running, Carlos, but you can already share your screen, no problem.
Okay.
The question is, are you familiar with the term ultra-processed food? And the three options are not familiar, somewhat familiar, and very familiar. We're gonna wait a few more seconds for everybody to answer, and then I will share the results.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, and I have to wait to share my screen, right?
No, you can go ahead, no problem.
Yeah?
Yes.
No, but I think it's while the others screen is being shared, I can't do it. Okay. Okay.
Perfect. In the meantime, I'm gonna share the results. So normally you should be able to see them on your screen.
Okay, 49% very familiar, 43% somewhat familiar, and 9% not familiar. Wonderful. Good. I hope at the end of this seminar, these statistics will improve. So my role here is essentially to tell you why NOVA was developed, what's the rationale for NOVA. Then I'll describe NOVA very briefly and maybe tell you about some applications and some new developments with NOVA. Okay, I don't know why I'm not. Okay, that's okay. So I'll start with the rationale. I'll go to description, some use and application, maybe some developments if you have time. So there are several reasons why NOVA was developed. Essentially, the question here is why a contemporary health-oriented food classification must focus on food processing nowadays. There are several reasons. The first one is that the content of critical nutrients in foods and in diets is largely driven today by food processing. By critical nutrients, I mean either the bad nutrients, sodium, sugar, saturated and trans fats, and the good nutrients, I mean protein, fiber, and micronutrients. Today, this content is largely driven by food processing, by how food is processed, much more than the natural content of these nutrients in the foods. But equally important is the fact that the other health relevant food attributes are also heavily influenced by food processing. I'm listing here 4 of these factors. First, the food matrix. What is the food matrix? The food matrix is a concept that involves the physical and chemical interactions between food components. So food is made of several chemical compounds and they interact, and this interaction is very important in terms of the effect on health. And food processing is essentially, the more we process a food, the less integrity I have in the food matrix, up to a point that we don't have more food in a product. We have just chemical compounds like sugar, fatty acids, amino acids, etc. A second important factor is that food processing also influences non-nutrient health protective food components. This is being called recently the dark side of nutrition. All the hundreds or sometimes thousands of chemical compounds that exist in food that are not considered nutrients, but they have an effect on health, like the antioxidants, for instance, all the phytochemicals, etc., etc. Another element, which is another attribute in foods that are influenced by food processing, is the presence of non-nutrient health risk xenobiotics. Xenobiotics are chemical compounds in foods that don't belong to foods originally and that are strange to our metabolism, like additives, for instance, like a molecule released by packaging, like new formed substances resulting from high temperature extrusion, for instance. And then we have several other attributes that are particularly important to regulate our energy balance. So I'm referring here to texture, to palatability, to thermic effect, to satiety. So all these attributes are important to the term energy balance, and therefore they are very much related to obesity, to the risk of obesity. And finally, eating patterns, again, very important to regulate the energy balance. So how, when, where food is eating also influences health, and also is influenced by food processing. The fact that food processing is important is being increasingly acknowledged. And the fact that particularly highly processed food and drink products represent a big problem. It was recognized in this publication, FAO WHO publication from 2019, where one of the principles of healthy diets is the fact that healthy diets are based on unprocessed or minimally processed foods balanced across food groups, while restricting highly processed food and drink products. But the problem is, what are minimally processed foods? What are highly processed foods? Until recently, we didn't have a definition for these terms, although they were often used. In 2009, we proposed a classification having these groups: highly processed food and minimally processed foods and highly processed foods. And then we decided to call the more highly processed products as ultra-processed foods. And we decided to use this name just to give a name that was not used before, to make it distinct from other vaguely defined concepts. So 2009 was the first proposition of NOVA. NOVA was not as in the situation we have it right now. I would say that in 2017, with this PHN paper, we really had NOVA in its definitive form. And recently, we wrote a paper specifically in the definition of ultra-processed food and how to measure ultra-processed food consumption. Well, let's go to the description of NOVA. But first, let's see the definition of food processing that we adopted. We are adopting here a food industry definition of food processing, which says that food processing is any method used to turn fresh food into food products. This can involve a combination of various processes, including washing, chopping, pasteurizing, packaging, cooking. And what's very important, food processing also includes adding nutrients, adding ingredients to food. Sometimes some people say that NOVA is too much based on the ingredients, but the choice of ingredients to make a food product makes part of food processing, of course. Where food processing lies within the food system? Food processing lies between agriculture and the kitchen, or between agriculture and the consumer in the case of ready-to-consume products. Just a few products are not processed before being consumed. Fruits, some vegetables. But they are exceptions. Most foods are processed in some way. That's why it doesn't make sense to recommend consumption of only of unprocessed food. Consumption of unprocessed food means that we should consume only fruits and some vegetables. But of course, this is not appropriate. But we can process food in different ways. And we can process food with different purposes. For instance, we can process raw rice into dried packaged rice. We can process raw milk into pasteurized packaged milk. We can extract butter from milk. We can extract olive oil from olives, or we can make more elaborated products like bread and cheese. These three groups, these three examples, they represent the first three groups in NOVA. So the first group, NOVA food group, is made of fresh, unprocessed, or minimally processed food. So NOVA does not distinguish fresh from minimally processed because they are very difficult to distinguish. And what are fresh or minimally processed foods are edible parts of plants and animals just after being separated from nature or modified, preserved by minimal industrial process. Which is important is that for being group 1, the industry cannot add sugar or salt or fat, anything to the food, it's just the food. Number 2, group 2 is made of processed culinary ingredients. These are essential to cook and prepare group 1. Here we have sugar, salt, fats, honey, etc. What's important in this group is that they are not consumed by themselves. Right? You don't eat salt or sugar. You use them to prepare, to cook, to transform group 1 into dishes and meals. Nova group 3 is made of processed foods. These are simple modified foods like bread and cheese or canned foods. You have the whole food added with salt or sugar or maybe some oil, some canned fish, for instance. These are processed foods. What are the processes involved with these 3 groups? Essentially, physical and process like removal of non-edible undesired parts, drying, chilling, freezing, pasteurization, fermentation, milling, pressing, centrifuging is used to produce culinary ingredients, and salting, baking, sugaring in the case of processed foods. And these 3 groups, these 3 Nova groups, are the basis of almost every traditional dietary pattern in the world. Here we have the Mediterranean diet, for instance, which is made, of course, of fresh foods, vegetables, for instance, group 1, pasta, group 2, olive oil, group 3, cheese. But there's a 4th group in Nova. The 4th group is made of ultra-processed foods. The main difference between group 4 and the other groups is the purpose of food processing. Here, the purpose is not to preserve food, is not to increase duration of foods, is not to facilitate culinary preparations, is not just to diversify the diet, as we do when we add to the diet cheese and bread, for instance. Here, the process, the purpose is to make convenient, meaning ready to eat or eat, imperishable, tasteful, low cost, meaning highly profitable products, which are liable to replace all other food. So the purpose of group 4 is not to complement the other groups, but is to replace them. And which is very important because they are ready to consume. You don't need to cook, you don't need to prepare. So kitchens are abolished in this with this product. And today in the market, for every group 1 food, for every culinary preparation, you have an ultra-processed version. And what are the processes used to manufacture ultra-processed food? A sequence of processes. We need to understand that behind the soft drinks or behind the ultra-processed snack or ultra-processed red meals, we have different industries. So everything starts with the extraction of oils, fats, sugars, starches, protein, essentially macronutrients from natural food matrices. A few ones like soy, corn, wheat, sugarcane. So having these food substances extracted from whole foods, the next step is involve chemical modification of these substances, like hydrogenation, for instance, of oils. Then these modified, unmodified food substances are assembled. And then here a series of very aggressive types of processes are used, like extrusion, deep frying, etc. But this assemblage of macronutrients, proteins, starches, fats, they are not palatable. They don't taste well. They don't have texture. Then it's the 4th step, which is essential and make part of the definition of ultra-processed food, which is the use of cosmetic additives. So emulsifiers, flavors, colors, etc. Everything is finished with sophisticated packaging, often using synthetic materials, and these are also important for health because they can release chemical compounds into the foods, like I mentioned before, the xenobiotics. So what's the definition of ultra-processed food? Ultra-processed food can be defined as industrial formulations of several ingredients that include original or chemically modified food substances obtained with a fraction of whole foods, as well as additives used to make the final product palatable or often hyperpalatable. And the aim, as I said, is to make convenient, tasteful, and low-cost products liable to replace all other novel food groups. Perhaps the definition is complex because it's not simple. Ultra-processed foods are not trivial products. They are complex. They are actually done with sophisticated methods by big corporations which count with technology and equipment and ingredients that you don't have in your kitchen, etc., etc. But there's a very easy way to identify ultra-processed foods, and we identify ultra-processed foods watching if the product, if the list of ingredients, that's the only thing the consumer has in hands. The consumer never will know how the product was made, actually. So the industry is not obliged to refer all the process used to manufacture product, but they have to put a list of ingredients. So if we find a marker of ultra-processed food, the product is classified as ultra-processed food. And what are these markers? Two categories. One is food substance never or rarely used in kitchens, like protein isolates, for instance. And the other are any type of cosmetic additive, flavors, colors, emulsifiers, etc. Another attribute of ultra-processed food is the brand, in a way, because the different from processed foods like bread and cheese that are made by thousands, tens of thousands of industries. Ultra-processed foods are made by a few large transnational corporations, like these 10 ones I have in the slides. These 10 food corporations, the global sales per day of these companies amount to more than $1 billion a day. And why this is important? Because this makes ultra-processed food very likely to be consumed by people, because these companies have the power to push the consumption of these products. In this slide, you can see how the amount of ultra-processed food consumed in 80 countries. So you see there's a large variation going from 6 kilograms per person per year in India to more than 300 in the US. You see that European countries, there's also large variation, Germany 218, Italy 100, Greece even less than 100. So this is important because this gives an idea about the future. And the future, if we consider the strategies of these companies, what they are doing to push their products, we can expect that in these countries where consumption is still very low, things can change very quickly. And this is true. Here you see in the all world regions, what was the speed of increase in terms of sales of ultra-processed food, particularly Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe. You see the increase between 2006 to 2019. Very quickly, uses and applications. NOVA has been used to describe dietary patterns, to study the impact of dietary patterns on diet quality and risk of disease, development of dietary recommendations, and policy and programs goals. This gives you an idea about the use of NOVA and this concept of ultra-processed food in scientific papers. That's a huge increase in the last 3-4 years. In terms of description of dietary patterns, for for instance, we can apply in NOVA, we can see the distinction between the national diet in Portugal and the UK. You can see the UK, most calories come from ultra-processed foods. In the case of Portugal, most calories come from group 1 and group 2. So people still cook and they still eat cold foods. So Daniela will talk to you about several studies applying NOVA to study the impact of dietary patterns on diet quality and risk of diseases. National dietary guidelines, we have up to now 5 national dietary guidelines that frame their recommendation based on NOVA. Brazil is the first one, Israel is the most recent. NOVA also has been used for establish policies, programs like the National School Meal Program in Brazil. In France, it was used as a target for to reduce 20% in consumption of ultra-processed foods. And PAHO in Latin America used NOVA to build a nutrient profile model. New developments, this is my last slides. NOVA, we can find some cell phone apps like Open Food Facts in Europe, and this is what we learned in Brazil. So consumers, they can see using the codes of bars to see what group each food belongs. We developed recently a NOVA UPF score, so is a system, a screening for consumption of ultra-processed food that takes just 2 minutes to apply. And we also developed in Brazil a software to collect and classify 24-hour diet intake data, which is being validated in Brazil. So now I pass the word to Daniela. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for this very nice, I'd say, introduction to what exactly is ultra-processed food, because we hear a lot about ultra-processed food, but now we have a better idea exactly of what it is. And it perfectly gives the floor to Daniela, who's now trying to present us how it can act, how it can impact on child health. So please, Daniela, thank you once more, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dave. Can you see my screen well? We
yes.
Need to maximize it.
Yes.
Or it's
Yeah,
fine?
you need to put that in full screen if you can.
Oops. I haven't been using Zoom lately. I've been using more of the Google one.
But we see it. We see it.
Maybe
Don't you?
Okay.
visualizar, I don't know.
Sorry, Milena?
Maybe in visualizar, the top of your screen. Yes, modo lectura.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. So we're talking about the consumption of ultra-processed foods and impacts on child health. And this is what I planned to talk today about ultra-processed food consumption among children worldwide, association between ultra-processed foods and child health, and the mechanisms that might explain the impact of ultra-processed foods on child health. So first of all, we need to think about what are children eating. And I'm going to share with you some comparative nationally representative dietary data from many countries, including European countries, of different levels of income and in diverse regions. But before I go into that, I wanted to ask you a question. So Milena, you are ready to go. Oh, Milena, sorry, this is Neha's question. Perfect. All right, so on average, what is the percentage of total calories consumed by European children per day comes from ultra-processed foods? And I see that most of you are quite sure that it's between 25 to 50% of the daily calories. So I'm going to share with you some data on a variety of countries in different contexts, and let's see how you guys did. But I think you are very close to what we have found in our analysis of a multi-country perspective. Find it now. All right, so here on the map, we can see ultra-processed food consumption among children aged 12 to 36 months. And this is nationally representative data from 7 countries. And these consumption results correspond to the relative contribution of ultra-processed foods to the total caloric intake. So we're gonna be always talking here today about this indicator, which is the percentage caloric intake coming from ultra-processed foods. And what we can see is that ultra-processed food represents between 16% of total caloric intake of young children from Colombia, and all the way up to 58% of the calories consumed by young children in the United Kingdom. As they age, among 6 to 11-year-olds, we see a substantial increase in the consumption of these products. And with the exception of Chile and Mexico, where preschool age children are the highest consumers, we see that school age children and adolescents, which we are going to see in this next slides, are really the highest consumers of these products. So overall, comparing to the general population or the adult population, children are really the higher consumers of ultra-processed foods, and globally they have this concerning issue of being the ones most affected by all the marketing and shape their taste preferences and consumption. So here I just wanted to show very briefly these trends in sales of commercial baby milk formula. This is historic and projected data on commercial milk formula, including infant formula, toddler's milk. And so these are the sales. And we can see here a big picture of the global milk formula sales boom. And much of the recent growth we can observe that happens here in upper middle income countries, where total volumes per child increased by 207% in the period of 2005 and 2019. So these trends show us can explain the global transition of infant diets based on these products. Now moving on to the association between ultra-processed foods and weight-related outcomes. Here just wanted to show this is the first piece of evidence among adolescents and adults, showing that the greater the consumption of ultra-processed foods, the greater the risk of becoming obese. Here, this is small perspective study of children showed that a high ultra-processed food intake is associated with increases in waist circumference at age 11. This other one shows that it's also prospective study and shows that a high intake of ultra-processed foods at age 6 was associated with an increased risk of fat mass index at age 8. And here is a recent large prospective study showing that the consumption of these products in childhood is really associated with worse adiposity, obesity trajectories tracing into early adulthood. So in this study, the follow-up was a really long follow-up from 7 to 24 years of age. And what we can see is that as ultra-processed food consumption is higher, we see a significantly higher trajectory of fat mass index and also waist circumference. And there was also a significantly higher trajectory of BMI Z-score and weight Z-score with increased consumption of ultra-processed foods. So in here we see among US adolescents that the greater the ultra-processed food consumption, we see an increased risk for overall obesity, abdominal obesity, and visceral overweight obesity, which we know increases the risk of cardiovascular disease in general. And now moving on to the association between these products and non-communicable disease risk factors. We have evidence showing that consumption of ultra-processed foods is associated at age 4, is really associated with increases in total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol at 8 years of age. And the high consumption of these products are also associated with the risk of metabolic syndrome in adolescents. Now, these studies showed that a lower ultra-processed food consumption was linked to a significant reduction in diastolic blood pressure, and this was in Spanish children from age 4 to age 7. Now, just to finalize these associations between higher consumption of these products and health risks. This is the State of the World's Children 2019 report. And it's very interesting that they brought the ultra-processed food issue of marketing, availability, consumption to the real heart of childhood nutritional risk factors at every life stage. And the report suggests that a reliance on this product can really increase the risk of all forms of malnutrition. So it's not only a matter of weight-related issues and non-communicable diseases, but also all the spectrum of nutritional risks. Now, what are the potential mechanisms for the link between ultra-processed foods and obesity? Well, Carlos provided excellent rationale about these potential mechanisms to link these products to weight-related issues and non-communicable diseases, but I'd like just to highlight a few potential mechanistic effects more related to children since the real first year of life. So as far as nutrient-related mechanisms go, we have a ton of epidemiological studies that made very clear that increased ultra-processed food consumption is really associated with a decreased dietary quality. And in this figure, we see that the relationship between the contribution of ultra-processed foods, here we can see how it increases, is really related to these changes in dietary content. So we see a strong association between consumption of these products and diets really with higher energy density, higher dietary content of the free sugars, and also with a lower fiber content, showing the potential to be associated, of course, with obesity with this unfavorable dietary nutrient profile. Now, regarding non-nutrient related mechanisms driving the obesity epidemic, it's very obvious for us that the aggressive marketing of ultra-processed foods through television, health systems, digital food marketing, and also with the use not only of sophisticated techniques to produce them, but also to sell them, can really shape children's taste, consumption, immediate and future consumption, as well as food brand preferences and also their families' purchasing decisions. And of course, these strategies are so powerful to consumers, especially vulnerable consumers like children, that they can really change perceptions related to appropriate foods for their age. The convenience of these products with the practical importable options that can be eaten at any time, anywhere, Also, there are long shelf life and increasing diversity in cost and type and ingredients that they claim they are included in these products. These are also very appealing to many consumers. And of course, it promotes shifts in home food consumption since the real first year of life. So we see detrimental impacts in food choices and home food acquisition, at home preparation of health meals, which can really decrease the confidence in cooking skills from generation to generation. And at the end of the day, it's really going to impact infant and young child feeding norm. In the past, breastfeeding, currently more towards infant formula and these toddler milks and other examples. These ultra-processed foods promote also shifts in mealtime environment and behaviors. Carlos already talked about this, but I just want to focus a little bit more in children because it has really detrimental impacts. So they can really cause these shifts by decreasing frequency of eating together, reducing opportunities for more family meals and time and communication, interaction at the table. And of course, they're going to interrupt opportunities for parental modeling of health eating, which is very important at these in the first years of life, especially. And they can harm the developmentally appropriate mealtime environment that would facilitate eating and also social exchange. So all these critical aspects of children's and adolescents' social environments are really disrupted by with the increase in the consumption of these products. That, as Carlos said, they are not meant to add to the diet. They are really like displacing the fresh and minimally processed foods that should be the basics of young children's diets. So these dietary patterns based on these products, they can really have bad consequences for children's palates, and they can define lifelong consumption patterns. And evidence really shows that longer breastfeeding and appropriate complementary feeding introduction predict health eating at middle childhood. And conversely, prepackaged baby foods predict high adherence to ultra-processed foods at middle childhood. And this has been shown in prospective studies, including infants, and then evaluating these babies, these children at middle childhood. Another relevant mechanism by which ultra-processed foods could increase the risk of weight-related issues is by limiting children's ability to regulate energy intake. This is one of the main mechanisms by which ultra-processed foods are associated with obesity. So these child-targeted products shown in these pictures, they have a basic characteristic in common. We can see that they are very soft, they are easy to chew, to swallow. And when we compare them to fresh foods like fruits and vegetables, poultry, meats, of course, they are much more difficult to swallow, to chew and swallow. So by combining characteristics like this actually, when they are very soft like this, they can be eaten in a much faster rate. And this has implications on the higher rate of energy intake. And when we combine this with another feature of ultra-processed foods with high palatability, this can be really easy to understand the overconsumption that they produce, the increased energy intake, which is all associated with weight gain, increased weight gain. So to summarize, here are just a few key take-home messages. Ultra-processed foods can contribute substantially to children and adolescents' diets of many nations. They represent a dietary nutrient profile consistent with an increased risk of obesity. They are also associated with further regulation of energy intake and unhealthy eating behaviors and pattern formation. And the increased consumption of these products really represents one of the main determinants of the obesity pandemic and consequent risk of non-communicable diseases. So this knowledge should be applied to create effective policy action to address the growing issue of consuming ultra-processed foods since the real first years of life, and also to address childhood obesity across the globe. And this is what Neha will talk about in detail right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for this very nice presentation that definitely comes with Carlos one. It's now a real pleasure to give the floor to Neha. Neha Khandpur, who is also a research scientist at the University of Sao Paulo. And Neha is going to talk about, now we know what ultra-processed food is. Thanks to Daniela, we know how it might impact our kids' health. And now Neha is going to explain us what we could do, certainly in terms of policies and in order to decrease the consumption of ultra-processed food. So please, Neha, it's a pleasure to give you the micro.
Thanks, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very well.
Yes? Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Could you please let me know that you see it okay when you do?
Yes.
Can
you
see
put
it?
that in
Okay.
full screen now?
It is in full screen. Do you see it in full screen?
No, it's not. It's not. Yes, it's full screen now. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, great. Then maybe, is there a lag, a delay in you hearing me?
We are hearing you perfectly.
Okay, you can hear me. Great, great. So at some point in time, if there is issues with connectivity, please do let me know. I'm very happy to perhaps pause my video. But it's such a delight to be here and to be part of this webinar. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me, and thank you all participants, you know, an audience to be here today. My presentation essentially is looking at the policy considerations of addressing ultra-processed foods. And I think of ultra-processed foods as part of, or ultra-processed food consumption as a systemic issue. And so the policy options and ideas that I share with you reflect the systems that produce ultra-processed foods and the environment that support its sale and consumption. All right, so the first part and a large portion of my presentation is going to focus on that bit, and then further down in towards the end of my presentation, we're going to talk very quickly about you know, the role of ultra-processed foods and that perspective, the NOVA perspective in the treatment and management of obesity. Let me see. Sorry. Okay. So we've seen from the previous presenters about the growing trends in the sales of ultra-processed foods across a variety of different contexts. These trends are largely unchecked in these contexts. We've seen from the previous presentation about the high consumption of ultra-processed foods among children, the negative impact that these products have on child health, on different facets of child health. This evidence is, you know, also mirrored amongst adults. And beyond that, you know, we've also seen and heard from Danny about how ultra-processed foods can be associated with a breakdown of social life, of culinary traditions. But there's other aspects to ultra-processed foods as well. And if you were to take the, you know, life course perspective of ultra-processed food production, if you were to think about, you know, the the processes that go into its creation, its processing, its retailing, its transport, its final consumption. There's emerging evidence to suggest that there are a potential host of environmental factors that may also be associated with the production of ultra-processed foods. So whether that is, a degradation of water bodies, detrimental changes in land use, deforestation, decreasing biodiversity. All of these are, other elements that are associated with, negatively associated with ultra-processed foods. So while our focus is very much on children and on child health, I think it's important to recognize that there may be broader agendas of safeguarding planetary health that very much align with the agenda on child health. And this plurality of health harms essentially means that we have multiple allies from different sectors, all hoping for the same objective, which is a reduction in ultra-processed foods, making it harder for governments to ignore this issue, and making it more likely to be, addressed via policy. So just a quick example of how the process of production of ultra-processed foods could contribute to environmental degradation. This is a study that found, that looked particularly at plastic pollution of marine environments, and found that ultra-processed foods, it found that foods really were the primary contributors to marine debris. And not just any foods, it was ultra-processed foods and packaging from ultra-processed foods that were causing a lot of the plastic pollution that we see in our ocean bodies. And we've seen the slide below before about the manufacturers of ultra-processed foods. Not surprisingly, they are also the top plastic polluters, associated or identified by these studies. I'm not sure you can see the bottom part of my screen, but it says plastic polluters here. So that was just to highlight to you that there's multiple reasons for policy intervention besides just the negative impact on child health and now on planetary health, most likely. And if I was to use the classic economics framework to try and present to you what these negative impacts would look like, they would probably be grouped under three aspects. We could think about them as externalities, negative externalities that are associated with ultra-processed foods, asymmetry in information associated with ultra-processed foods, and the third one is consumer irrationality that's also associated with ultra-processed foods. And so let's break these down, these three aspects that I just spoke about. If we think of negative externalities, we're basically thinking of the costs associated with the health harms that come with the consumption of ultra-processed foods. So whether that is absenteeism, increased healthcare costs, disability. There's also now the component of potentially potential harm to the planet. So those are some serious negative externalities to consider. When we're talking about asymmetry of information, if you remember from Danny's slides, we were talking about deceptive marketing of some of these food products. There is also clear evidence that not everything that is presented by way of nutritional information on ultra-processed food products is indeed the truth. There's a lot of this nutrition information that isn't fully presented to the consumer when they're at point of purchase looking to choose ultra-processed foods. So that contributes to the asymmetry of information. And there's also consumer irrationality. I think this is very clear when we're talking about children, because children are not rational actors. But there's also, even when we think about adults, there's also all of the deceptive marketing that goes into ultra-processed foods that sort of stimulate subconscious decision-making within adults as well. So that contributes to the argument of this, of them not being, rational actors at time of purchase. So all of these aspects put into the economics framework essentially add up to what we could think of as market failures, which mean that the government at some point needs to step in and do something about these, correct these market failures, and it essentially provides a strong basis for government intervention. So what is it that we want governments to do? And what is it that we want from policy intervention? So essentially, I think we could summarize these in 3 points. We'd like them to minimize harm to human and planetary health that stem from ultra-processed foods. Now that I've presented you, this one additional piece of information, but really, it's about focusing on making it easier to choose non-ultra-processed foods. So going back to Carlos's presentation about, choosing minimally processed foods, culinary ingredients and processed foods, that is what we want to drive choices towards. And to make minimally processed foods in diets based on these foods available, affordable, appealing, and aspirational for children. And so this slide essentially, when we're thinking about how we can make diets appealing, available, affordable to children, I think the policies that need to address this issue need to focus broader. So they don't necessarily need to focus only on the actor as the consumer, but really on the systems that drive and enable ultra-processed food production, and the environments that enable ultra-processed foods consumption. So these two, frameworks that I have in front of you on the screen are essentially to illustrate that point. So if we're looking at ultra-processed food consumption here, so we're looking at ultra-processed food consumption here and various health outcomes. There's a whole host of systemic and environmental indicators that drive essentially consumer behavior to choose these diets. And this is essentially what I want to highlight here, that there's a huge complex industry system, a commercial food production system, an environment, various environments that facilitate the choice of these foods over others. And those are really the systems and environments is really what we want to be targeting through our policies. And so what might this package of mutually complementary actions look like? Again, this is very clearly a package and not just one action that we're talking about, given the complexity of the issue. The authors of this paper, I thought, presented some very important considerations by highlighting important actors and environments and the role of the government in sort of stimulating this change via policies and programs. So for instance, they talk about fiscal options like taxing unhealthy food products or subsidizing healthy foods to make them more affordable. So here we're talking about taxing ultra-processed foods and making minimally processed foods more affordable, setting food standards in schools, incentivizing retailers to enter low-income areas to benefit, to make sure access to these foods is not, healthy foods is not an issue or a barrier. Among the retailers, we're talking about redesigning choices available at point of sale. We're talking about, legislating for consumer-friendly nutrition labeling, investing in infrastructure. So a lot of these are changes that are happening even before we look at the consumer. But there are some, policy recommendations around changing demand for certain foods, shifting it towards healthier policies, choices, influencing each other as role models and caregivers. So this is sort of like a series of options of policy measures that address key actors in key areas of the production of ultra-processed foods and the consumption and sale of ultra-processed foods. And I wanted to just very quickly present the Chilean case study as a concrete example of how multiple strategies have been put into motion, have been implemented in the context over there to address exactly these kinds of foods. There, they define products as HEFSS, which is essentially products high in energy, saturated fats, sugar, and sodium. They have implemented mandatory warning labels. So all products that meet a certain criteria or certain threshold, they must carry a warning label for each nutrient that they have in excess. Now, remember, the nutrients that they're talking about are added sugar, sodium, saturated fat, and calories. So that is one concrete policy that Chile has implemented on all of its products that they define as HEFSS, a large portion of which are ultra-processed. There's also the question of school-based restrictions. So the products that have been identified and have been flagged as being, tricky, ultra-processed, of concern, they must not be advertised or sold inside schools. So they're trying to make schools ultra-processed free zones, essentially. They have an existing sugary drink stacks that they plan on amplifying and adding on not just sugary drinks, but including all other HEFSS foods as well. And then there's the policy on marketing restrictions. So these products that have been flagged are banned from being advertised on television or in cinemas. And there's a watershed moment as well. They're not allowed to be advertised or marketed between 6 in the morning and 10 at night, or anytime during children's programming. So there's, and also the packages themselves must not carry any sort of promotional figures that might appeal to children. So just to give you an example of what that looks like in practice, this is an actual Kellogg's breakfast cereal before the implementation of this 4-pronged policy to improve the diets of the Chilean population. And here you see what that looks like after. There is no promotional figure in the form of the tiger. There are no health claims here. The products carry the front package warning labels here to highlight that they're higher in sugars and calories. And so this is one of the few places, a few countries and contexts where there hasn't been just a singular policy that has attempted to address the increase of unhealthy ultra-processed foods, but a series of measures that have been implemented about the same time. And just to sort of share with you some other policy actions of, mutually complementary actions and what they could look like. We spoke about, breastfeeding and the importance of that. There's breastfeeding guidelines, there's baby-friendly hospitals that promote breastfeeding. There's initiatives to support women's choice to breastfeed, to safeguard her, to have maternity protections in place within the labor market, regulations of marketing of breast milk substitutes. All of these are potential policy actions that might be considered. Again, expanding from just looking at ultra-processed free schools, we could think about, ultra-processed food-free childcare settings throughout the life course, essentially, of children. Development and implementation of food procurement standards or guidelines are another potential policy item that could be thought of. I know in Brazil, this has been in place for a while now, where at least 30% of all foods that are procured for the school feeding program, school meals, have to be from local farmers. And I believe in 2023, 75% of the budget that's allocated to these programs and the preparation of these meals has to be towards minimally processed foods. So those are, other policy ideas and strategies to consider. There's also the need, I think, to start thinking about amplifying marketing restrictions from not just television, but to extend to digital marketing as well. And I believe there has been some proposals in the UK examining this as well. So these are some, potential strategies to think of. Carlos had briefly mentioned the importance of having food-based dietary guidelines. And I'd just like to reinforce this point because as we see it, food-based dietary guidelines for children and adults are essentially, they're the foundation of policy programs. They are the justification for new policies that come through. They're the official position of that government on healthy eating and what constitutes healthy food. They're revised with quite some frequency in various contexts. And so to think about incorporating the ultra processing perspective into these policy guidelines, into these dietary guidelines, is of quite importance. And it, to especially to have them emphasize the preference for minimally processed foods and the avoidance of ultra processed foods. If promoting hand prepared and home prepared foods, all of these reinforcing that and saying that explicitly within food-based dietary guidelines is essential. I think France and Belgium and Israel are some of the newer adopters of the phrase ultra-processed in their dietary guidelines. And just a quick note here to say that terminology really matters. There's a reason that it would be important to use the term ultra processed when you use the term energy dense, nutrient poor, when you use high salt, sugar, fat. It's rather a nutrient centric perspective. If you think about framing food-based dietary guidelines to have the terms discretionary foods, non-core foods, single out unhealthy food products, it sort of signals that the choice is on the consumer, the responsibility is on the consumer because it's consumer centric. It's the consumer's discretion and their choice whether or not they want to consume these products. Having terms like fast food or junk food, essentially be part of the dietary guidelines leaves room for ambiguity. They're not very easy to interpret, and especially with the evolving marketing practices, it's not often easy with the new wave of foods coming in to identify junk food because they aren't necessarily packaged the same way. They could be positioned very differently, for instance, marketed to seem sort of like the healthier alternative, like, for instance, cereal bars are, you know, or sports drinks. They're not necessarily interpreted by a large portion of the population as junk, but they would, you know, under the ultra-processed framework, the NOVA framework, be identified as ultra-processed. And so using the terminology ultra-processed within these dietary guidelines is actually really useful because it makes it very producer-centric. You see, you know, processing sort of factor in to the policy aspects of things as well, and the responsibility and the signaling here is really not so much on the consumer, it's more on the producer. And some other strategies that might be useful to consider that could be thought of as being more child facing is the introduction of the ultra processing perspective into STEM curriculum. So a science, technology, engineering, and maths curriculum could incorporate this in their teaching to children within schools. We could think about having skill building specifically around, you know, cooking or the ability of children to navigate the food environment. Read nutrition labels, so label literacy, be able to identify and avoid deceptive marketing. Those could be other aspects to think about when we're thinking about policies and policy actions and interventions. And there's always education campaigns to improve UPF, ultra-processed food literacy, and knowledge of, you know, NOVA and of food processing. And so we've just spoken about, you know, some of the strategies to address ultra-processed food supply, sale, and consumption, and we've taken a really broad look at the food and the agricultural systems that, you know, churn out these products, and some of the environments in which it is eaten, and how we could sort of intervene within these spaces to promote choices of healthier products. And I'd like to just very quickly, towards the end of my presentation, shift gears a little bit and think about how we could incorporate this concept of ultra processing foods in interventions that target obesity treatment and management. So all of this time that we spoke about these various policy options, I think the broad goal there was really prevention of chronic diseases like obesity. And I'm curious to hear from you, actually. So I have a quick question for your feedback about the possibility of incorporating the food processing perspective and the concept of ultra processed foods, as we've just, you know, shared with you, into the design of treatment and management initiatives for childhood obesity in particular. So please go ahead if you have a quick second to leave us your reply. All right. Oh, okay. So we've got a large majority of you essentially thinking of this as it being necessary for obesity treatment and management, and a fewer of you thinking that it's likely to be useful. Thanks, Milena. I think great. Thanks. So I am curious, honestly, to hear from you and the practitioners in the audience about this topic, essentially because in my reading of the literature, there aren't very many papers, and there isn't a lot of published literature yet on how interventions, focused interventions, have targeted the treatment of obesity or its management. And I found this one study that I present to you here, which essentially I think was conducted with around 70 children that that were either overweight or had obesity. They were separated out into control and intervention group, and the intervention group got nutrition counseling and behavior modification interventions, while the control group did not. And they found an improvement in the BMI of the intervention group. Of course, the focus here was looking at decreasing ultra-processed foods consumption. And so they did find some decreases in the consumption of key ultra-processed foods as well. And improvements in, I think it was waist circumference and the BMI of children in the intervention group, and a reported increase in the quality of their life. So there seems to be some value in incorporating ultra-processed foods and that perspective into interventions. But clearly, I think more research is needed to really understand, the extent, the ways in which this concept could be integrated, and really to determine its overall utility. But if this was found to be beneficial, then some of the strategies to incorporate ultra-processing in the management of obesity is what I present on this slide. Essentially, we could think about healthcare provider education and training, and this goes back to things way back to medical training. So that would mean thinking about updating their curriculum to incorporate the latest knowledge that we have about ultra-processing, clinical interactions with patients at point of care when we're talking about nutrition counseling or education or literacy at point of care with clinicians. Ultra-processing and the NOVA concept could be brought in at that point. There seemed to me in my cursory look at various clinical practice guides around treatment and management of obesity and the various protocols that they could certainly be updated to incorporate this perspective. Even not just the treatment management protocols, but also the practical guides for families. There were a few places where you could see them allude to junk foods or fast foods. There were examples of allowing children to consume cereal, breakfast bars, etc., which they clearly thought to not be ultra processed, but we know that they are, a large majority of them at least. And so these seem like certain entry points essentially for now in incorporating the ultra processing perspective in obesity management and treatment. And I'm sure there are others, so I'd be keen to hear from you. And very quickly to summarize then, there clearly is a need for government-backed policies and interventions to address ultra-processed food production, sale, consumption. These policies and interventions must target systems that enable production and the environments that enable sale and consumption. There could be certain child-focused strategies that should certainly be considered. And there maybe some value in incorporating the ultra-processing perspective in disease management, especially for obesity treatment and management that we could explore in more detail and further down the line. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is my last slide. Thank you all very much for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you very much, Neha, for this great presentation. And I think we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. And I think that maybe, Neha, you've already answered some of them. But Bernadette Keane asked us also, how do we hold companies responsible for creating those foods and particularly aiming marketing at children and adolescents? So I don't know who can handle this question from our panel, Neha, Daniel, or Carlos.
I could give it a shot and then perhaps open the floor to Dr. Monteiro.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, so I think it's less about holding companies responsible, and it's on an individual basis, and more about creating a certain social norm around how the public wants to interact with the products coming out from these companies. And so creating these, policies around restricting marketing and, in all spheres, making certain environments completely free of these products. I think that those are some strategies, policies that have currently been implemented that perhaps could, I think, they sort of speak to this question to some extent. I'm gonna let Carlos and Danny jump in as well.
Yes, I want to add something to this discussion. It's often said that what drives ultra-processed food consumption is the low price, the fact that they cost very little for people, and then poor people have only can afford to have ultra-processed food. This interpretation we see very often from people based in the US. So, I mean, Kevin Hall, for instance, interpret his trial, he mentioned that poor people only can afford ultra-processed food. I disagree with that. I think that the main driver is not price, and then this is maybe different in different places. But when you see, for instance, consumption of ultra-processed food in the US, you see that it's a little more consumed among the low-income people, but difference is very small. You have, let's say, 55% of calories among the rich and 59 among the poor. So it's really very small, the difference of it. So my point here is that particularly in terms of children and adolescents, marketing is the key thing. So investments in marketing and the non-regulation of marketing and very sophisticated marketing, including online marketing, trying to make people see ultra-processed food as something something modern, something more. So I think marketing regulation is essential. So if we only focus on price, I think it's not so that's my point. Marketing is key to understand the penetration of ultra-processed foods in every country, and particularly in low and middle income countries.
Thank you, Carlos. So we have a second question. Maybe I'm gonna just, maybe for Neha as well, you have provided example of policy actions in Chile based on the HEFSS nutrition profiling, including FOB labeling. So why do we need UPF is the question.
That's a great question. All of these are great questions, by the way. And I think the way that we think about this is that when we break it down into HEFSS, we're essentially breaking it down into nutrients, right? And we're saying, okay, these are the key nutrients that we think are associated with are of public concern and are associated with health harms. And so these are the nutrients that we want to tackle. And while that's not a wrong approach, I think the value that ultra processed foods or that concept adds here goes deeper. So essentially, when you focus on these key nutrients, it allows the food manufacturers to start tweaking those nutrients to just below the threshold, right? And consequently, there are increases in other ingredients. For instance, we've seen this in Chile. There's increases in artificial sweeteners being added. There's increases in coffee, caffeine being added. Further down the line, as the industry avoids just being under the radar of the most recent food policy and tries to reformulate its products, there's going to be other potential ingredients of concern that keep coming up. What ultra processed foods and that concept provides is inescapable. It essentially says, well, this product is ultra processed, and it doesn't matter how much you play around with certain ingredients or with other ingredients, or you swap ingredients, it's always going to remain ultra processed if it is continued to be manufactured in this manner. And I think that is the value really of that additional perspective of thinking about these products as ultra processed and how that enters the food supply, as opposed to thinking of these as nutrient high in certain nutrients and not others. The other point to this is also, then there's the whole it opens up the debate of, well, there's certain minimally processed foods that are also high in HEFSS. I'm clearly having a hard time pronouncing that acronym. But so will they also then enter the policy debate? Like, will they be taxed? Will there be a front of package warning label or another type of front of package label put on there? Like, so it just kind of muddies the waters. It complicates, I think, the dialogue around these products, and in my opinion, it muddies it in favor of the food industry. That is why I think ultra processed, and I'll let Danny and Dr. Monteiro add to that.
Okay, thank you very much, Neha. I think we are almost out of time, but maybe just last question to all of you. If you could briefly all just give a short answer. How do we influence behavior change? Because we can nudge consumers, but if they are unwilling to change their food behaviors, it's very difficult to convert all these wonderful ideas into real life practice in the lives of consumers. Maybe a few last answer. If there are questions that have not been answered, don't hesitate to send a short message to ECOG, and we will make sure that we transfer your messages. Who wants to take the floor? Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I can say a few words on this. So first of all, it's a long process. Nobody believes that it's possible to reorient dietary patterns in every country in a matter of months or of 1 or 2 years. This is a long process. First, I think this is the first thing. But if we don't, if you don't have the right goal, then we never will reach this goal. So I would say that. And the nutricentric, just to complement what Neha said, the nutricentric approach is inappropriate, and not just because of the fact that it does not distinguish ultra-processed from processed food, but because also leads to the idea that a healthy diet is made of superfoods. Then I think I see the same problem with those that defend ultra-processed foods and with those that defend superfoods, that healthy diet has to have some very nutrient-dense food. So finally, healthy diets made of fruit and vegetables and nuts. I mean, this is crazy, because nobody feed themselves with the fruit and vegetable and nuts. So, but this is because of the idea of the nutricentric approach. So I think we have to get rid of this nutricentric approach. That's all. Thank you.
And just a few words here to complement with other questions that I see here. Carlos' answer was perfect. But when we are dealing with children and regarding like changing choices and without increasing blame and shame, I think we needed to focus on the positive aspect of the diet instead of be addressing the ultra-processed food consumption, but the other side, like increasing fresh foods and homemade meals. We really need to understand the dynamics of the family meals and work a lot on eating behaviors that we could see that has a lot to do with increasing the opportunities to have ultra-processed foods coming to the house. So we also really needed to check, work on the physical environment, of course, where these families are grocery shopping, where they are going out to eat, and these are great opportunities to address, to help them finding better options when they are out. So this is very important for families with children.
Thank you so much, Daniela. Well, I think that we've reached the end of the webinar regarding the timing. And looking at all the comments we have on the chat or on the Q&A, I really want to thank you all, Carlos, Daniela, and Neha, for those wonderful presentations. And I really think that they were very helpful. Whatever is our professional activity, I think that the three presentations gave us new insight and more clarity on what ultra-processed food is and the impact on our health and what we could do to regulate first and then to reduce ultra-processed food consumption. It's been a real pleasure to host this webinar, especially since you're all from Brazil. Neha, I'll let you in Brazil for a few more days, but you're all from Sao Paulo, and this is really something that ECOG wants to increase, is a partnership with other countries, and especially with experts like you are from specific topics. So I really, really want, on behalf of all the ECOG and the ECOG members, to thank you, and I'd love to thank also all the attendees and those wonderful questions. So I will be glad to see you all live during our next meeting, I hope, maybe not this year, but maybe next year. And I would remind everyone that we have e-modules, e-books, and that you can watch the replays of all the webinars. And do not hesitate to propose topics that ECOG could handle and on which ECOG could organize webinars, because ECOG is here to translate research into daily practice. So we are here for practitioners, and this is practitioners who decide what ECOG should speak about. So please do not hesitate. Thank you so much also to Milena, because you haven't realized, but Milena is not feeling very well today, and she did a great job as usual. So thank you so much, Milena, for organizing this meeting and for making it happen. It was just perfect. Thank you to all, and hope to see you very soon. Take care.
Thank you, David, and thank you for everyone to have joined us today. This was a great webinar. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.